Good morning and welcome to the Killik & Co market update. The biggest news this week is Boris Johnson's suspension of Parliament. So Boris Johnson has managed to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks across September and October. And this really doesn't give MPs much time to do anything before the Brexit deadline of the 31st of October. In particular, it doesn't give them time to get through a change in the law in order to ban a no-deal Brexit. So since this news of the suspension came out, we have seen quite a rise in the implied probability of a no-deal Brexit. So have a look at this chart here. This shows the change or the rise in the implied probability of a no-deal Brexit since April this year. So you can see that that probability rose across June and July as Boris Johnson moved ahead in the polls. It went still higher when he took office, and we have seen a further spike this week when the news of the suspension was announced. Now, when the news of the suspension was announced, we really actually didn't see much of a market reaction. We did see a very small fall in sterling, and we also saw a fall in some of the more UK-focused names, for example, some of the UK-focused banks and the house builders, but overall there really has not been a major reaction this week. And I think that's largely due to the fact that a no-deal Brexit is already largely priced into the market. Now, something we've been looking at recently is the rise in the popularity of so-called min-vol funds. Now, min-vol basically stands for minimum volatility, and the funds that are based on min-vol will invest in companies that have previously exhibited very low levels of volatility, and people tend to invest in these when they're a bit concerned about the wider market. And companies within these min-vol funds tend to be in fairly defensive sectors, for example, healthcare, for example, consumer staples, so companies producing things like toothpaste and deodorant, things where the demand doesn't really change based on economic cycles. Now, over the last 2 years, we have seen quite a rise in the value of these so-called minimum volatility stocks, and we have seen that they have outperformed the wider market by quite some margin. So have a look at this chart here. The green line shows the MSCI World Index, so that's basically the global stock market index, and the pink line shows the minimum volatility index. So that's basically the same index, but with all the volatile stocks taken out. And you can see that the outperformance of these minimum volatility stocks is more than 10%. So they have done very well, but this does say to us that because so many people have moved into these more defensive sectors over the last few months, perhaps some of them have now become fairly expensive. So we would recommend having a look at your portfolios, perhaps having a look at some of these really defensive stocks that have come up a lot in value over the last few months, and just have a think about whether some of them do look a little bit overvalued. So that's something I would recommend having a chat to your investment manager about. And finally this week we've had some fairly positive news from China. So the company Costco launched its first store in mainland China this week, and the crowds trying to attend the store were so large that the store actually had to close early. And we just took this to be fairly positive news for 2 reasons. One, it shows that the consumer demand in China is still alive and well. There is still certainly a large amount of consumer demand in the country. And also perhaps because of the trade war, there has been some concern that some Chinese consumers might turn their back on Western brands, but the popularity of this new Costco store does imply that to date that has not been the case. So we just took that to be a bit of positive news. Now, moving on to the week ahead, the corporate calendar does look fairly quiet, and we haven't really got that many companies reporting next week, but we are just keeping a very close eye on the negotiations between Boris Johnson and the EU, and of course the court cases that have sprung up as MPs have tried to contest the suspension. So that's what we'll be keeping an eye on over the next week. That's it from us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next Friday.